think we're ready to get going, to kick off proceedings. So welcome. My name is Ben Caldecott. I'm the chair of this year's summit, and it's great to see you here. A very warm welcome to Oxford for the third such summit. It's great to be back after 2 years, following successful summits in 2022 and 2023. Out of interest, who was here in 2022? Raise your hand. Great. And who was here in 2023? Okay, cool. All right, well, those that have been here since, have been to the first two, will get you some kind of medal or something as we go. You'll collect them. But summer 2023, when we last came together, it feels like a lifetime ago, and it's hard to think of 2 years when we've seen greater change, at least since 2001 or perhaps even 2008. Despite that, though, some things remain the same, including this wonderful city and many of the venues, historical venues, you're going to be spending lots of time in over the next 2 days. So it's wonderful to see some of you from previous summits, also quite a few new faces, new friends, and also to welcome some early career researchers from Oxford, but also from other institutions around the world who have been able to come to this conference. Before we dive in, I wanted to offer up a thank you to the organisations whose funding makes our work possible, including but not limited to this summit. In particular, I wanted to call out some recent supporters of our work, including Barclays, Santander, Bank of America, Insight Investment, as well as the SED Fund and the IKEA, Sequoia and Hewlett Foundations. Their support and that of many others allows us to undertake the research that we do, to engage with policy and practice, as well as to provide financial support for graduate students and to provide subsidised places at events like this, but also on our courses, particularly for those from the public and third sectors and also those from the Global South. I also wanted to thank the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute for supporting us as part of this summit as we engage with the asset owner community globally. Now, the overarching theme of this year's summit is reinvention and renewal, and clearly a recalibration of sustainable finance is underway. And after a decade of almost uninterrupted expansion, we now face consolidation in the face of geopolitical tensions, economic uncertainty, huge generational advances in technology. And these are reshaping the risks and opportunities we've been thinking about, investing in, avoiding, and they challenge us to find new, more effective ways of mobilizing capital to solve social and environmental outcomes, social and environmental challenges. And I think there was a sort of a time when maybe we thought that progress was going to be linear or it was assured. But I think as we reflect on what's going on in the world, and we have sessions on these topics, the politicization of ESG, the backlash against net zero commitments, among other things, these are significant headwinds, and our task this week is to confront those realities head on and identify some practical pathways to keep us moving forwards, to allow us to keep making progress. And I think the ostrich in the head strategy is going to be given short shrift at this conference. We're going to have to confront these challenges openly and transparently. And while what we face is daunting, and we have to recognize that and its causes and its consequences, we've got to also remember that the community of actors working on these topics has also changed significantly, even in the last few years, both qualitatively and also quantitatively. There are more people working on these issues than ever before, with capabilities that didn't exist even a few years ago. And that means we have capabilities and networks that were unavailable to us in the past, and that gives us options and opportunities that we can harness to reinvent and renew. And the idea is that we'll explore those here over the next 2 days. So we put a lot of effort into the summit. We design it to create time and space for you to get away from the office, to critically engage with emerging theory, emerging practice, to meet old friends, meet new ones, and to have some fun in lovely places. And the summit program has been designed closely with colleagues across Oxford. The sessions are all on topics where we're doing significant work here at the university, and I hope you get that sense from the panels and the discussion. We've also taken account of feedback from previous years and other things that we do, and have, among other things, a few more spotlight sessions. And these are on technological or geographical development. So we have one on India tomorrow, we've got one on the EU, we have a session on carbon removals, we have one on GLP-1 agonists, but we're also confronting some big cross-cutting issues that are very much finance adjacent, but very relevant still, such as the future of climate politics, and the next session on the challenges of polarisation. We've also added, for those so inclined, a social, easy 5K run tomorrow morning, if you want to join. Details of how to do so are in the programme. I also wanted to emphasise, and I say this every time, but we want each session to really get into an issue in a meaningful way. And that means a slightly longer and more expansive conversation that you might not normally get at an industry conference. And sometimes panelists come to me and go, Ben, you really want me to be on a panel for an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes? I say, yes, because we want to peel back the layers of the onion and get into the heart of these issues. And actually, once you get going, the time flies, particularly when you have good audience participation. So this isn't about the sort of the standard 6 to 8 panelists in a 40-minute session doing a 3-minute spiel on what they're selling you. We're not doing that here. And critically, we also want this to be a space where there is debate and actually disagreement, though I should emphasize that we want you to disagree in an agreeable way. So through that respectful process of debate, we can individually and collectively learn and find out how we can navigate these shared challenges. So in that spirit, we want to see that in every session, but that's why we also have a closing debate, and we've done that since we started. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the motion should be to try and provoke some soul-searching. So the motion this year is, this House believes the global ESG backlash is justified. And we have 2 great teams who will be debating that on the second day in the Sheldonian Theatre. So thank you to those that have agreed to participate in that. And I wanted to say just a few words about some of the things we're doing at Oxford. So this is obviously an area that's relatively new among the newer fields of research and teaching at Oxford, but one where we have quite established and world-leading capabilities. So the group that I lead, the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group, we're based at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and we're the focal point of those activities at the university. And we were set up to align finance with global environmental sustainability, and we seek to define what best practice should be and ratchet up that practice and socialise it globally. And at the summit, you're going to meet many of my colleagues in the group, as well as our colleagues working across the wider university in different departments. But I wanted to flag 5 nearer-term opportunities to continue your engagement with Oxford during and after the summit. So the first thing is something called the Oxford Sustainable Finance Lab. So in our first summit in 2022, I was sort of looking for a great announcement. And so, yeah, we're going to set up this Oxford Sustainable Finance Lab, and we managed to get some funding for it. And the idea was that this is a physical space where Oxford researchers can co-locate with practitioners, coming from financial institutions, from supervisory authorities, from central banks, from civil society organizations, and so on, with the view that we get a lot of people wanting to spend time with us, and actually it's a great opportunity for us to collaborate with practitioners and also with colleagues in other bits of the university in a physical space, so we can work together on sprints and joint projects and sandbox things together. And I was sort of optimistically hoping that we would get this up and running in winter 2022 or spring 2023 at the latest, but actually getting these things through the university system could be quite challenging. But we finally opened last year, and it's now open to visitors, and we have this wonderful 2-story space just up the road, just off the High Street on King Edward Street, which is part of Oriel College, with wonderful views over the Radcliffe Camera and refurbished in a way that it encourages people to spend time and have meeting rooms and use the facilities. Anyway, so if you'd like to use the lab during your stay in Oxford, including after the summit finishes, if people are sticking around on the Friday, there are details for how you can do so in the program and in your registration email. We have different ways that you can be involved after the summit, and happy to explore that with you and your teams if we can find synergies with the work that we're doing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you love Oxford in the summer, and you want to come back and you can't wait until the next summit, we actually have 2 symposiums at the end of July. This might be overkill, but there might be some of you who are that keen. So the first is on the 30th of July, and this is together with Share Action, and we're hosting a closed-door gathering on stewardship in turbulent times. So this is going to bring together seasoned leaders with deep expertise in capital markets to reflect and exchange on investor stewardship. So if you work on stewardship and engagement and you think that's for you, it's invite only, so reach out to me or reach out to Catherine Howarth at Share Action, who is either here or will be here later in the week. And then the following day, sucker for punishment, we have, on the 31st of July, we're hosting the inaugural Oxford Symposium on the carbon removal budget, and basically achieving the net in net zero is about carbon removals, and we need to think critically about how carbon removals are integrated into emission pathways for companies and for countries. And we believe that one of the next frontiers is figuring out how we scale up those carbon removal efforts and integrate that into what companies and countries are doing, as well as financial institutions. So this inaugural summit's going to provide hopefully some deep insights into that issue. We're treating carbon removal as finite. At the moment, the market seems to think it's infinite, and that's obviously not the case, and so we're going to have to figure out how we allocate a finite carbon removal budget. So that's an open application event, and details are on our website, or you can contact me or contact Ingy Johnston, who leads on carbon removals and carbon markets in the group. Fourth, you can apply, or your colleagues can apply, for one of our open enrollment executive education programs, and our capacity building and training team are here. They have a stand in the examination schools with brochures and other such things. If you want to find out more about that for you or your colleagues, then please do talk to them. Our flagship course, which is the Sustainable Finance Executive Program, that's our next in-person course. That takes place on the 15th to the 19th of September in Oxford. And then finally, the fifth thing I wanted to flag was in 2020 we established and continue to fund something called the Oxford Sustainable Finance Student Society. And some of those members of the society are here helping us with the organisation of this event. And it's one of the most vibrant student societies at Oxford, with undergraduate and graduate members across the university from different disciplines, different departments: law, history, maths, biology, geography, the business school, and so on. They have a great term card. I think it's one of the attractions for students who are thinking about where to go to work on these topics is actually that society. And they do field trips and careers fairs and things like that. So check out their website. Think about how you might support them by hosting them, maybe speaking at their events, maybe even funding their activities, and maybe even thinking about how you can offer some of our great students internships and other career opportunities. That would be my final thing to mention. So lots of ways to engage, and there are other ways that we could talk about later. So, when we're designing this, we also are striving for as much diversity as possible in all of its senses. And for example, we aim for a 50-50 gender split for speakers and chairs. And so for the third time in a row, we've met that goal, and this year we have 53% of our speakers and chairs being women. And as we look ahead to future summits and events, it would be great to have suggestions for future speakers that come from underrepresented groups. So please think about that as you engage in topics, and feel free to just ping us an email with a suggestion, or volunteer yourself if you're interested. And that can ensure we have vibrant events in the future. The other thing is, and I kind of alluded to this before, but to help ensure access, we also have heavily subsidized registrations and free tickets for academics, for students, from people from the public and third sectors. And that's only possible because of the funding that we get. And while we can't always give as much support as we'd like, the levels of subsidy and support are quite significant. So if there are organizations and individuals who want to support access in this way, also please do get in touch. Okay, so some admin announcements, and then I'll hand over to the next panel. So there is no fire alarm today. Exits are clearly marked. The team here will guide you, but there's lots of signs with exits. The muster point, I think, is Actually, I've totally forgotten, so ignore me. You'll be directed if there is an alarm. All the sessions are recorded and will be made publicly available online after the event. They're not being live streamed, but they will be made available. Wi-Fi is available throughout. Details, I think, are on your lanyards. Please wear your lanyards at all times. I've been told to emphasize this very strongly, including at the dinner, so we can keep track of you and give you access to things, if you have that access. There are meeting rooms available. We've got most of this whole space. There are lots of rooms downstairs. Some of them already been set up for speakers and for interviews and things. But it's possible if you need a space to either use the lab, which is up the road, or to get a room here. And Patrizia in particular can help with that. So the sessions we now have, the next 2 sessions are going to be plenaries in here. This is the South School. After lunch, we move into parallel sessions. So one session will be here in the South School, and the other parallel session will be in the East School, which is straight through there. Most of tomorrow will also be in parallel sessions, except when we go to the Sheldonian for the debate and then onwards. So for those with dining tickets, the drinks reception and dinner is at the Divinity School at 6:30. So when you're finished with your parallel sessions, you head there. There won't be a plenary before that. And just to emphasize, both the reception and dinner tonight and the reception and dinner tomorrow at the Ashmolean are for dining ticket holders only, and we're fully booked. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so that is it from me, you'll be glad to know, until tomorrow. I hope you have 2 wonderful days, that you have great, interesting conversations, you meet new people. And without further ado, it's now to the first panel, and Leo Johnson is the chair. So over to you, Leo, to talk about polarisation. Thank you.
Ben mentioned backlash, headwinds. Can we just try something before we get into the panel? Can we just try something as a group? Just sense check what we're all, as change agents, coming across in the last year. Can you stand up, including the panel, if over the last year you feel kind of the headwinds have got stronger, the going has got tougher? Got a few people sitting down still. Okay, all right, okay. Can you stay standing if you yourself have come across actual backlash or polarization, or you've really felt you've got to drop something? Wow, okay. Okay, stay standing if you've completely got it figured out on how to deal with it. Okay, no one, you got one. Okay, all right, great. We'd like to talk to you. So look, what we've got here is a group of people who they're kind of in the trenches, in different ways, in different parts of the system, and they're grappling with these dilemmas. We got Andre, who's, his work at JP Morgan Chase in the carbon transition side, former head on the environmental risk management side. We have Alicia at the FCA in charge of regulating sustainable finance. We have Joanna, who you're going to, we'll be hearing from all of them, but Joanna's experience covers MC Saatchi, designing the MC Saatchi Life, trying to sell the concept of sustainable living, head of sustainable and healthy living at IKEA, and then putting it into practice, actually building the place where you could live a sustainable life. And we have Holly Pattenden, who's the head of policy and regulatory affairs at Equinor. So they're right, I hope you'll agree, in the center of this. And what I'm really hoping we're going to get is kind of their stories, and collectively some sort of arsenal of a few techniques that help change agents grapple with these dilemmas in this crazy moment that we're at. That's kind of it, and we'd love to sort of get them to talk for 10 minutes or so where they tell these stories, and then we'll throw it open to the room for questions. Does that sound like a plan? Great. And then I'm going to ask, I think, Joanna, kick us off.
Right. Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Joanna. I think I'm the only one on the panel with slides, and there are rather a lot of them, so please bear with me. But don't worry, I don't work in finance, so there aren't any graphs. It's almost all pictures. Okay, well, we won't need to dwell on the doom and gloom side of things, but I've been working in sustainability for over 25 years, clearly rather badly, because over that time things have got quite a lot worse, not just on climate, but across the whole range of ecological as well as many social indicators. And so when those of us who stood up for most of Leo's questions acknowledged the fact that things are getting worse, the challenges are greater, and the feeling of polarisation and forces being against us is greater, it is hard to take heart, isn't it? But I do think it's important to remember nonetheless that the mandate for change, for positive action, has possibly never been stronger. So here we are, the White Cliffs of Dover. This was a piece of research actually last year by Oxford University. The People's Climate Vote, which is run regularly and has been done since 2015, asking citizens worldwide, this was 130,000 people across 125 countries, if they would like governments to take more climate action. 89% of people say yes. And the majority of those think they're in the minority. So for those of us as humans, as parents, as citizens, as financiers, as business people, who feel like we're alone in being concerned about this, one of the biggest barriers, I think, to change is that we feel that we're in the minority, and we're not. So Leo asked us to talk this morning about how to make good stuff happen, how to get people to do good stuff. Well, clearly none of us have actually got the answers to that. So all I'm going to do in my 10, 20 minutes is share some of my stories from the last 25 years and around 5 key themes. Well, I think one of the first observations is when we talk about climate action or sustainability more broadly, we very often dwell on the problems, and I think John Gardner a few years ago described this rather well. It's a series of great opportunities, actually, disguised as insoluble problems. So perhaps that's one first part of our brief, is to now start focusing pretty damn fast on finding the opportunities here. So as I said, I've worked in sustainability for 25 years, and I probably classify myself as an environmentalist and an activist for longer than that. As I said, I've probably not done it very well. None of my peers have. Things have got worse. But perhaps that's partly because, as Larry Seltzer from the CEO of the Conservation Fund said, the environmentalist movement evolved to stop bad people from destroying the world. So we've perfected the art of saying no. But we can't know our way to the kind of growth that we need. So if you're an environmentalist, or if you're a financier, or if you're a business leader, or if you're a concerned citizen, no's not enough. What do we now start to say yes to? So as I said, I've worked in sustainability for some while now, as Leo alluded to, across a panoply of different projects and sectors. I've worked as a consultant, I've worked as a broadcaster, I've worked with city leaders, I've worked with business leaders, I've worked more recently leading sustainability in IKEA, in M&C Saatchi, and now in Human Nature, which is a placemaking company. And yes, climate action and sustainability more broadly has been a theme, but actually those aren't different topics. That's not a new and extra agenda that's landed at us from outer space in the last 50 years or so. It's actually the compound result of how we live. Those problems are the compound result of how we organise our society, our economy, and our institutions. So actually, for those of us wondering what we can do about this, I think we need to be asking a different question than how we take climate action or how we resolve polarisation. We need to be asking a much simpler question, which is actually, how shall we live? How do we want to live in order to give more people a better quality of life, more of the time, in ways that respect ecological limits? So that's what I see my brief as being. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is just 5 lessons learned in that question to answer how can we live and how can we inspire and enable more people to live better and, as part of that, lower carbon lives. Well, this might seem a bit obvious, but I think the first thing we've got to do is to stop talk about problems and challenges and start talking about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Because if you're working in sustainability, I mean, first of all, you've got 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. That's quite a big to-do list. So the problem is, if you're really serious about this, you can feel like Michelle Lee, you've got to do everything, everywhere, all at once. We kind of have, but that's not a very easy brief. So the way I like to think about it is much simpler. First, understand, yes, we need to understand how we're doing things now and what the problems are, but we also need to understand where we're trying to get to. So if we think about 2030, 2035, let's say 2050, and the world as we know it's likely to be then, ecologically, economically, demographically, and how we're going to need to live then, we can start to say, okay, well, what role can I, or my institution, or my fund, or my city, or my business, or my school play in that? Because I can't do everything everywhere all at once. And then, if that's my brief, how we're going to need to live by then, what could and should I be focusing on within my gift, within my skill set, to make that change happen faster? So that's kind of what, in hindsight, we ended up doing when I joined IKEA in 2013. So anyone here not got anything from IKEA at home? Oh, well, welcome. Let's see what I can sell you later. No, I don't actually. I no longer work there. But most of us are familiar with the Scandinavian Home Furnishing Company. And it's been around for a while. And when I joined, we just put together the first global sustainability strategy called People and Planet Positive. And it was called that for a particular reason, which there's not just environment, it's about both people and planet. It's not just about doing things less bad or having zero impact. Gosh, that's something to look back on when you're on your deathbed. It's about creating a positive impact. And IKEA actually was not set up to sell tea lights or Billy bookcases. The founding mission of IKEA by Ingvar Kamprad was to create a better life and a better everyday life for the many people, which is kind of Swinglish for as many people as possible. So when I joined, I was the first person in the biggest market with the job title Head of Sustainability. It had been kind of behind the scenes before then. It was risk and compliance and so on. But I thought because it was a Swedish company, it had been doing good stuff on supply chain, I'd be broadly welcomed. And I was a bit surprised when I started to get some backlash internally. I started to be asked by co-workers across markets, but particularly in the US, why IKEA was going political. And actually, what we realized as we leant into this challenge together was that we weren't taking on a new challenge when we started to talk about climate action, for example. We were going back to this founding mission of how can we create a better everyday life for as many people as possible. And in fact, to do that, we needed to address climate change because that was affecting our supply chain, it was affecting the lives of our customers, and so on. We also realized that actually, of all the things that IKEA could do, supply chain and operations was important, but the biggest area it could have that positive impact in terms of how we should live how we could live in 2030 and beyond was via consumers and via people's everyday life at home. So that's how we got to the point of creating the strategy, building on the founding mission of IKEA. That wasn't changing, but it was to say, okay, how can we stretch that to look at how we can, through our current business and operations, but also new business growth and focus, inspire and enable 1 billion people to live a better life within the limits of the planet. So that was an example of going from understanding what the business was setting out to do originally, understanding where its strengths were, understanding the future of the world as it would be for those future customers, and then leaning into that role. So the second thing to do, of course, is once you've kind of nailed your brief or the vision of the role, type of role that you could play in the future, is to work out your levers of change. What are the things that you could do that are really going to make a biggest difference? So as Leo mentioned, I now help to run a company called Human Nature. And what we're setting out to do is to build Britain's leading sustainable places and developments, so neighbourhoods. So if we think about where we live, actually very often, rather than inspiring and enabling a more sustainable way of life, they depress and disable change. The way they're designed, built and run forces into ways of living that actually worsen ecological and social problems. But actually, when we do them differently, we can make places, communities, homes, neighbourhoods have a big role in inspiring and enabling a more sustainable way of life. So when we think about the power of place, it's not just about materials that they're built from, that's important. It's not just about operating efficiency of the buildings, although that's important. It's about so much more. It's about the way people get around, what they eat, their social interconnections, the types of businesses that are there. So those levers of change, all individually, are very powerful in terms of the brief of someone designing and running a place, and together they can really start to create the exponential change we needed. So an example of that, we have a project down in Lewes, where I live, called the Phoenix, and it is a project for 685 homes, workplaces, energy production, food production, and so on. It's a brownfield site. It's been light industry for 150, 200 years, on the edge of a floodplain. And last spring, we got permission to build this neighbourhood, mixed-use neighbourhood, largely of bio-based materials. It will be the largest bio-based material building in the UK. And the way that we created that brief was, yes, I mean, it's lovely working with lots of architects and designers and materials and all very creative, but there's actually the geek, I lead the geek squad, sitting behind the scenes, where we have our dashboards, where we say, let's look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and all the other goals and metrics that funders, that planners, that all the ecosystem that needs to support a place like this prioritizes. And let's look at all the different ways that we can design in the building and the running of a place to achieve maximum impacts for climate, nature, and human flourishing. So focus on the outcomes. Find the levers of change that you can make the biggest difference through. But then there's something, and this sounds a bit more hippie, but the idea of inspiring and enabling change. We can be worried, or we can be hopeful, and that can motivate us to change. But unless we are empowered, unless we have the ability to make change happen, not much is going to happen. And there's a gap, I think. So that stat of 89% of people wanting governments to take more climate action, unless the government knows what to do, or the financial institution knows what to do, or I as a householder know what to do, all we have is inspiration. Similarly, when we were at IKEA, we commissioned GlobeScan to do longitudinal research, still ongoing today. I'd tap it if you want stats and get under the bonnet of this. They're a fantastic partner to work with, where we looked across 33 markets at many hundreds of thousands of people's attitudes to climate action. And we saw this big gap. Over 80% of people worldwide concerned about climate wanting to take action. Less than 9% feeling they have the agency to make action happen. So when we think about any action we take, we have to do those two things. We have to say, this is the problem, or this is the change that's possible, here's how you can do it. So similarly, in placemaking, it's not, we probably all know that getting in a car every day isn't great for climate, let alone human health. But unless a place is designed in ways that don't force us all to own and use 2 cars per household, there's not much we can do about it. So I also want to talk briefly about the power of experience and what Rebecca Solnit calls a new social imagination, which is that, this stuff is scary, big, different, and does involve change. Until recently, it's felt very far away, either geographically in time, perhaps less so today, but very few of us have a lived experience of what better living can be like. So at IKEA, one of the things that we did, both with our co-workers and our customers, was to create opportunities for us together to try out living differently. So for example, creating social experiments with households, hundreds of thousands of households worldwide, into sustainable living, and then using the findings of that to drive our communications programs, but also our range and design and product design, the way stores are run, the way that whole neighborhood centers are created. And then just lastly, I'm talking at you for too long, we tend to think that this is an information or a communication problem. I'm not sure it is. I think it might also be a listening problem and a collaboration problem. When in Lewis, where our Phoenix project is, 2,000 people came out on the streets to protest against development in the town. Not our development, this was the previous proposal. They wanted homes, they wanted jobs, they wanted facilities, but they wanted to be asked about what they were like. And so we ran 3 years of really detailed, I won't call it consultation, it was experimentation, it was design festivals, it was bringing in experts, it was bringing in local experts, it was bringing in young people to together explore the problems and design the solutions. So that when we went back to planning committee, we had several hundred people protesting outside the planning committee for the project. So coming back to this question of how we will live, getting under the skin of actually what people need and want. The cost of living, new jobs, together doing that and creating this new shared vision of how we can live will, I think, be one of the key things to overcoming that polarisation problem. So the world, it's something we make. The problems, we've made the problems, we will make the solutions and the way of life that they bring. And this was something rather nice that someone said at the end of that design festival at the Phoenix. This looks like the beginning of the future. So creating that shared vision of what better living can look like might be one of the best things that we can do to address the polarisation issue or the perceived polarisation problem. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. We'll do questions at the end. Holly, let's hear from your perspective.
Thank you. I come to this from quite a different perspective, which is the perspective from the energy industry. I joined the energy industry because of 2 main drivers. One was that I was interested in trying to tackle climate change, and another was the Iraq War, which happened shortly after I left university, and I went on that march in February 2003 that Ian McEwan immortalised in his book Saturday. And at the time, everyone was talking about the role of oil in the decision to go to war in Iraq, and that was a major motivating factor. And I became very interested in the role of oil in global politics and how we could understand it in order to begin to effect change. When I joined, as was Statoil, now Equinor in 2011, the company's strategy was all about going deeper, faster, further. exploring in all kinds of new areas for more oil, getting more of the same, expecting 15 to 25% returns. There was worry about peak oil at the time, peak oil supply, that we wouldn't have enough oil to meet the world's demand. And when I joined the company, I thought this is something that we need to change, and we need to talk to top management to get them to change their thinking. A couple of the arguments that worked were, one, strangely enough, from the Saudi oil minister, which was that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And the oil age isn't going to end because we run out of oil. It's going to end because we have something better. Another argument that worked, and this was probably the most effective, was that if the business is not sustainable, it will not be sustained. So it's an existential challenge, and one that needs to be addressed. And we had to, as a group of young people joining the company at that time, trying to change minds of people who'd been embedded in the industry for a long while and had very healthy livelihoods as a result, was to force a series of acceptances on their part. The first was for them to acknowledge that climate change was man-made and a real problem. And the second was that we were part of the problem. And then the third was that we could be part of the solution. It sounds strange to suggest that an oil and gas company can be part of the solution, but if you needed to create an agent of change for the energy transition, you would look for a large industrial company with a solid track record of delivering large and complex projects, that's well capitalized, that has a patient long-term investor, and progressive and forward-leaning owners. My company is 67% owned by the Norwegian government, and Norway certainly does have a strong commitment to decarbonization. So we started to talk about what we could do in order to become part of the solution. The first thing was to drive down production-related emissions. The second was to start investing at scale in renewables. And the third was to invest in carbon capture and storage. When it came to investing in renewables, because of the company's track history in large, complex marine installations, it made sense to begin with offshore wind, and that's what we've done. So today, we supply around 30% of the UK's gas via pipeline from Norway and 15% of its oil. But we also built the world's first floating wind farm in Scotland, and we're now building the world's largest offshore wind farm at Dogger Bank, which will supply around 6 million homes when it's complete in 2027. We've been working on carbon capture and storage in Norway since 1996, and now have built Northern Lights, which is the world's first cross-border carbon capture and storage facility. And in the UK, we're partners in the Northern Endurance Partnership, which is one of the first UK carbon capture transmission and storage systems. And we're in the Net Zero Teesside Power Station, which will be a first-of-a-kind gas-fired power plant with carbon capture. It's no coincidence that these multi-billion-pound investments that we've made have been in Norway and in the UK. And that leads me to a couple of thoughts on what effective climate leadership looks like. It starts with ambition, and then it needs to be backed up with funding from government. In fact, I'd go further and say it requires a leap of faith by government, investors, shareholders, and individuals. The UK government did take that leap in 2008 with the introduction of the Climate Change Act, and then with its amendment in 2019, writing the Net Zero 2050 target into law, although we still don't know who'll go to jail if we miss that target. And that process also established the Independent Climate Change Committee and the system of carbon budgets that's been the bedrock and framework for energy policy and investor confidence in that area. And while the government sets the ambitions and provides the funding for that, it is companies that will be the agents of change. So the government says it wants 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, but that doesn't become a reality until the steel hits the water. The political cycle is a lot shorter than the capital cycle. The energy industry makes multi-decade investments. Until recently, we thought we could continue to do so with real confidence based on a cross-party consensus that tackling climate change was imperative and that while it would be costly to drive CO2 out of the system, the costs of inaction far outweighed the costs of action. The situation in the UK looks quite different now. The consensus, the cross-party consensus seems to have broken down. The Conservatives are challenging the 2008 Climate Change Act to the point where they may seek to amend or even repeal it in their next manifesto, while Reform is challenging the very concept of man-made climate change. In that context, companies are beginning to find the limits of how far they can lean forward. So why has the consensus broken down? I think polarisation isn't just a problem when it comes to climate change. In this age of short attention spans, people are reading the headlines but not the articles. They're looking for easy answers packaged as pithy sound bites. Advocates for climate change are labelled fanatics or zealots by their detractors. And we face ideologues at the political extremes or populists who offer only easy answers to complex questions, as Ed Miliband, quoting Theresa May, said on Monday. And in an age where we're really keen to put people and ideas into boxes, we've seen an association of climate change activism with a package of political views and an appropriation of that as part of the culture war. In this way of looking at the world, you have to buy the album. You can't just choose your favourite singles, and all the nuance is lost in the noise. Some have argued that the energy transition was overhyped or oversold as a win-win situation. And the truth is the transition is messy, it's non-linear, and there are trade-offs involved. So what are those trade-offs and which ones can we accept? So looking again at the UK as an example, the Labour government is making great strides. The Clean Power 2030 action plan has set an incredible stretch target that has galvanised action. Massively expanding renewable power generation is a great ambition. It will require billions of pounds worth of private investment, backed up by public investment in infrastructure, including doubling the size of the electricity grid. We should do it, of course, but the challenge with such an ambitious target date is that it leads to an approach where we do whatever it takes, whatever the cost. And at the same time as the Labour government has set this ambitious clean power target, it's also committed to energy prices coming down. Of course, in the very long term, the fact that there are no input costs for renewables mean that electricity generated by renewables is cheaper. But there are system costs involved as well with the infrastructure that needs to support them. And we already have the most expensive industrial electricity prices in the developed world. And at a household level, consumer debt for energy was £3.4 billion in 2024. That's doubled since 2021. The public support for tackling net zero, excuse me, the public support for tackling net zero is still there, as Joanna pointed out. But when we look at the so-called energy trilemma, that's the need to tackle the three elements of sustainability, security of supply, and affordability, the focus has shifted. Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought the interrelated challenges of security of supply and affordability to the fore, and that was at the expense, in my view, of the sustainability imperative. With climate, if we're going to get anywhere, we need parties across the spectrum to tackle it. And I see a first step towards rebuilding consensus as a more realistic assessment of what it will cost. Paying higher energy bills and higher taxes while using less energy is not a message any politician can sell. We have to decarbonise, and we have to do so at a cost that society will accept. Otherwise, and this is what Labour is worried about and the Tories are exploiting, people will be lured to those with easy answers. The debate at the moment around the planning and infrastructure bill brings some of those trade-offs to light. I was recently in Norfolk where we're planning a massive extension project for our 2 wind farms off the coast there. And I saw the trenches that are being dug for the cables that will bring the offshore wind power to the grid. People in the area are naturally very opposed to the blight on their natural landscape. And we've seen a bit of a shift from NIMBY, not in my backyard, to banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. In Norway, we've had Greta Thunberg campaigning against onshore wind farm building because it conflicts with the rights of indigenous reindeer herders in the region. So both with nature and with humans, there are trade-offs, and they're ones that we need to be upfront about. So how do we build strategies that are resilient? Recently in the US, we've had a real test of our offshore wind strategy with our Empire Wind project. So that's a project where we're trying to build a massive offshore wind farm off the coasts of New York and New Jersey, 130 turbines, 2.1 gigawatts. On the 16th of April, we received a notification from the US administration of a stop work order, where we had to down tools on the project because it did not fit with the current administration's view of what we should be doing. It took an enormous amount of effort and diplomacy to try and get that project back on track, and was costing 50 million a week or so while we did that. The eventual resolution, of course, was a deal. And the deal was effectively that we were allowed to resume work on our offshore wind farm on the condition that the New York state government accepted the construction of a large new natural gas pipeline across New York state territory. We also face shareholder and stakeholder fragmentation. While the Norwegian government owns 67% of my company, it's also listed in Oslo and New York. And this year at our AGM, we had 2 shareholder resolutions back to back. The first asking us to exit the oil and gas business altogether, and the second asking us to exit the offshore wind business altogether. Our strategy is to remain an energy provider through and beyond the transition, and to continue providing the energy that's needed now to build the infrastructure that we need for a zero-carbon future. We're taking a lot of bets in different energy technologies, offshore wind, solar, batteries, CCS, hydrogen, direct air capture, balancing across the risks and opportunities. And the UK is at the heart of that strategy. It's got so much to offer the world when it comes to decarbonisation. Some of the best wind resources on the planet, so much so that much of the seabed that could be used for fixed bottom wind turbines is now taken up, and we're moving towards floating offshore wind technology. That's a real potential competitive advantage for the UK and a potential export industry for floating wind technologies that can be used in the rest of the world. We also have a massive geological advantage for carbon capture and storage. And it makes sense that we can use that geology to store both the UK's carbon and over time to bring in CO2 emissions from the industry of continental Europe to help them decarbonise as well for those hard to abate sectors. And we have world-class research and development in our universities, in technology, batteries, long-duration energy storage, that we can get faster and cheaper decarbonisation. So net zero is achievable by 2050. I've seen a credible roadmap that costs it out at around $40 per tonne of CO2. Today, the world produces around 50 billion tonnes of CO2. If we do nothing, by 2050, it'll be around 80 billion tonnes. That's just from energy demand growth. So at an average $40 a tonne, 80 billion tonnes a year is $3 trillion a year. If we assume by 2050 global GDP is around $200 trillion, then that's 1.5% of global GDP. The US gives 2% of its GDP per year to charity. So we can do the right thing, and I think we will do the right thing. As Al Gore said in his TED talk a couple of weeks ago, political will is itself a renewable resource. We need to talk to those who disagree with us with respect, avoid the temptation to brand them or ignore them and put them into convenient boxes, and rebuild the consensus we need to get to a net zero future. Thank you.
Andre.
Thank you, Leo.
Thank you.
So, as I was reflecting, Leo and I have known each other for more than 2 decades, and as he was asking me to reflect on my role in the financial sector, I guess as a change agent, I was thinking back to when my interest in this space started. And when I was studying both environmental law and environmental studies, this was at the end of apartheid in South Africa. And in 1992, at the same time, you had the first Earth Summit, for those of you who may remember, in Rio. I think some of us are old enough. And what is interesting is I think, coming into the space, both from an educational perspective, from a societal change perspective, and just understanding the broader geopolitical ecosystem around me when I was just graduating, it was a time in which there was hope, there was change, and certainly in South Africa, it was an incredible experiment where you basically had South African business deciding apartheid is unsustainable, we need to change this. And so that basically drove a lot of my thinking and a lot of my peers' thinking. And so it was no surprise when I eventually went into banking. I was doing project finance, export finance, financing actually a lot of natural resources projects, that it made so much sense for us to start looking at the environmental social impact of what we did, just given the societal expectations and understanding of again, the broader environment that we lived in. And that certainly carried me through into when I in early 2000s, I moved to Amsterdam into a role focused on environmental and social risk. That's when Leo and I first met each other. And I still remember some of the learnings, because Leo was doing a lot of training for financial institutions at the time, who literally then were just stepping into their roles of trying to understand what environmental and social issues actually meant from a banking perspective. Because historically, I can remember when we were financing oil and gas projects in South Africa, the only environmental requirements was one sentence in a loan document which said compliance with World Bank standards. No one ever understood what that meant, or certainly I don't remember ever looking at that. You fast forward several years and there was a realization that actually the financial sector has a significant role to play in understanding how their clients are operating from an environmental and societal perspective. And the focus at the time was this debate between Milton Friedman-esque, the business of business is business, so don't bother yourself with broader societal and environmental issues, versus the emergence of stakeholder capitalism. And certainly, as I moved to Amsterdam, I was with a Dutch bank who was very progressive on these types of issues. And instead of the business of business is business, it was more about noblesse oblige, that it is our role as a financial institution within certainly Dutch society to pay attention to the broader social and environmental ramifications of the finance that we provide, and clearly not just in the Netherlands, but globally. So that was a time certainly for me when I was just cutting my teeth in the space, having come from, as I said, an environment, educational and societal environment in South Africa where we had gone through significant change, where we thought things were possible, where there was a lot of hope, there was a lot of change in the world going on, fall of the Berlin Wall, glasnost, perestroika, etc. And then I think what was interesting is we started being confronted by some of the pushback. And certainly I thought that it was common sense that we needed to behave in a certain way and be holistic in our thinking and be far more informed in our decision making as a financial institution when it came to these issues. So I was somewhat surprised that there was pushback. Common sense wasn't common. And what I realized was there were times when you did have to say no because we thought it was the right thing to do. But saying no very clearly closes doors and closes minds. And I think that's one of the challenges I've certainly seen throughout the time in this space. And I think particularly now where the evolution of the subject matter, I'll call it more broadly, environmental, social topics, climate, has moved from, for the first, I'd say, 15 years of my time in this space, was more a reputation issue to the financial sector than a financial issue. Certainly, at the time, if you think just before the global financial crisis, we started seeing financial institutions, certainly when Leo and I were consultants together, we started seeing financial institutions asking the question, is this just about reputation risk, or is there actually a financial imperative to us digging into and understanding the realities of what our clients are doing, not just from a let's call it environmental, social performance perspective, oil spills, no disrespect, displacement of people in indigenous communities, but if you actually start thinking, and this was the time in which you had Mark Carney talking about the tragedy of the horizons, you had some thinking carbon tracker, I'm sure a lot of you have spent time looking at some of the carbon tracker work, where concepts such as unburnable carbon, stranded assets, the carbon bubble, were starting to be discussed certainly within the financial sector. And I think that was the time when it concretized for a lot of people, including Mark Carney, again, tragedy of the horizons, Al Gore himself saying the next financial crisis, remember this is just after 2008, 9, 10, the next financial crisis could well be one about carbon, where the financial markets are overexposed to carbon assets. And if there is an abrupt energy transition, what does that mean for the financial sector? So we started thinking about these issues, not just from a reputation perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And it is interesting, just reflecting on my own journey, I moved, certainly within the organization I'm in right now, I moved from a risk role, where I headed up the team for 10 years, into a front office role, when we decided to come up with our own net zero targets. Because we realized that this was now moving the agenda from something which was a risk management topic to make sure we understood our clients' performance, to a business imperative. It was a strategic issue that we wanted to better understand what our clients were thinking about, certainly climate change, the climate transition, and fundamentally how we as a financial institution can actually help them with facilitating the trajectories, the journeys, the transitions that they were all on. And that remains a core part, certainly, of what we focus on, what a lot of, I know my peers in other institutions are focused on as well. I think what is potentially a little bit challenging, yes, we're going into I guess, a dynamic now where you've got a new administration in the US, and it's not just the US, you've seen a lot of other jurisdictions starting to question the pace. Is the transition, as we've defined it using some of the net zero trajectories and net zero scenarios, is that actually realizable and realistic? What is the price tag? We've heard $5 trillion a year, and we're only at roughly about $2.2 trillion if you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance assumptions. So there's still a lot of wood to chop. There's a lot of financing which needs to flow into the solutions that we need in order to facilitate the energy transition. And just reflecting again on the role of banks within the space, I think is one that does need to be recalibrated. And what I mean by that is I think back to COP26 in Glasgow, where the headlines were $130 trillion of assets under management, financial assets under management, have now made net zero commitments. So we're good. The financial sector has ridden in on its white horse, and they'll take care of this. And that was misplaced thinking, because it's not the financial sector's money, it's our money. We don't control where that capital is deployed. We do to some extent. And that whole narrative and debate is one that still is one that we're discussing. There clearly is a role for the financial sector to play, absolutely. There's more than enough capital to finance the transition. Unfortunately, what we don't have is that there just aren't enough projects against which to deploy this capital. And that comes back to, do we have the right government policy which is actually enabling our clients to invest in the assets that are needed? And that's the dynamic that we certainly are making sure is out there, that narrative needs to be understood. That it's not just about switching off oil and gas and then magically the alternatives are going to appear. The energy transition is a tough one. And we've seen in some of the harder to abate sectors that you're starting to see commitments that were made by companies in the industrial sector and the transport sector. They're starting to rethink these. The German government, as you've seen, had quite progressive targets when it comes to hydrogen, green hydrogen, for instance. Even they've started looking at whether or not that's realistic. Now, this is not all I don't think any of this recalibration is a bad thing if what's left is a focus on the realization that Banking 101, Economics 101 still needs to prevail, that we need to make financial sense of these, because certainly if I think of the conversations that I've had within the organizations I've worked in or consulted to, that's what actually moves the needle, is demonstrating to someone that you don't do this just because it's the right thing to do. The right thing to do also means it needs to make financial sense. The business case is one that you really need to focus on and to present, and that's something we certainly find in our client conversations, in conversations internally with our bankers, and increasingly with the broader stakeholder community who are realizing what the role is of the financial sector within this space. So it's been an interesting journey, certainly, where I've said it's moved from a topic where initially I thought it was common sense for us to look at these topics and take them into account. I think as this starts moves from a reputation issue to something that actually has financial consequence, we need to be a lot sharper about the dynamics, the narrative, the focus on what is it actually going to take in order to achieve the transition. And that's something I've certainly seen that a lot of banks have stepped up into. The opportunity for us is significant. We have seen that the proportion of, let's call it, green wallet share to a financial institution is increasing and will continue to increase. It's just a matter of making sure that we identify where the obstacles and hurdles are that are preventing some of these transition activities from being financed and from being developed. And that is the role of, I guess, change agents within the financial sector, is to make sure that we may take, from time to time, a lower return on certain assets. We may take more risk on certain transactions. And that again, is the role of the financial sector. But fundamentally, it's understanding those risks and making sure that we're clear-eyed into what our role is and how it is we can actually help facilitate the transition.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you. So we've got projects, got capital. What about the regulator's perspective? Alicia, over to you.
So I am sorry, because the regulator section is always the boring part of a panel, and it's last, so sorry guys. But I can keep my remarks quite short, because I think a lot of the other panelists have already covered some of the excellent points that you guys have made, which I agree with. I am going to speak in a personal capacity, because as the regulator, I sit across all of financial services, finances, sort of ubiquitous and necessary for so much of this to happen, but I'm going to just give my personal views on this. I will say one thing on the record, which is my accent is Canadian. And I was told a wonderful joke this morning, which I'm going to steal and repeat, which is Canada is not polarized, we are united against Trump, which I thought was a good one. So, I think when we sort of started to see some of the polarization and the backlash against ESG, for example, I'm the head of sustainable finance now, not ESG, because of the political nature of that term even. I think it's very important to go back and sort of look at the kernel of truth in the criticism that you are receiving and why the polarization is happening. And I think one of the things that really struck me is actually a lot of what you discussed, which is there was so much thrown into the bucket of what sustainability was going to achieve. And perfection is what a lot of parts of the market were aiming for, that it became unrealistic to actually do so much of this in practice. So just reflecting on that, I think one of the big things that has become very clear for us is that it's very sort of important in doing this type of work to actually think about what is that outcome. I think somebody else mentioned it. What is the outcome that we're actually trying to achieve with the work? And to be quite practical in that. So for example, we think very carefully about the stakeholders. I will say this from a work perspective. We think very carefully about the stakeholders we're engaging with and what are they actually set up to do. So financial services firms, they are profit-making organizations. They are not necessarily there to push through, in most countries, not in all, public policy. And that's one of the things that I think has been quite good in terms of the reflection that I definitely see happening across the market and that I've done myself, is a focus on why are we actually here and what is our role in that? Because we are not all there to do every single part of the puzzle. So for example, I always sort of challenge our team on what is our mandate? What do we exist to do? What risks actually matter to us? And we need to focus on those because there might be something over there that looks incredibly interesting, but that's not why we exist. That's not what we are there to do. And I think that's very important within all of the different roles that all of us might play in the market to really focus on what we are there to do. I also find that from a sort of practical perspective, there has not, sorry, maybe I'm too close to this. Is that better? Okay. From a practical perspective, I don't think there has been always a truly evidence-based debate on which of the policies and which of the work really needs to go forward. There has been a lot of push for that perfection. What can we do because it feels right? But there does actually also need to be critical thinking about a lot of this. And I think from the polarization, at least from, again, my perspective, we've taken that step back, and I definitely have looked at how we position the work, what we think about, and what we really prioritize based on evidence. And that is, there was a period where I don't think that was necessarily happening to the level of rigor that is really, really required. And from sort of the impacts that some of this can have, I think there is obviously the bad. You know, when we have this type of polarization, you do see a lot of work possibly being put down, a lot of targets, you know, firms are less ambitious, governments might be less ambitious, they are swayed, and that can delay a lot of this. I think on a personal level, that's probably scary for a lot of us, you know, especially if you've been in this area for a long time. But I do want to actually also give a little bit of hope and optimism on that, because so much of what we are working on is actually, there are real fundamental risks underlying so much of this. And those risks, whether or not you call them, you know, sort of sustainability, sustainable finance, flood risk, hurricane risk, tornadoes, the impact that this is going to have on assets, those are all very real. And the piece that I have absolutely observed over the last, let's say, year, is that there is a much bigger focus on that much more specific identification of what we are actually trying to solve for. So it's no longer the, you know, sort of much more ephemeral, high level, you know, climate change is bad, we want to do things around sustainability. It's actually getting into the specifics, which I actually think, again, my personal view, is probably a good thing, because it means that we are naming the problem, and that makes it a lot easier to try to deal with. I also think that in terms of the international space, because I have both a national role, so Andre and I know each other from the national work, I also have quite a big international role, so I spend a lot of time dealing with our international counterparts. I would say there is a galvanizing of quite a few different both initiatives as well as sort of countries coming together, because again, it doesn't matter where you sit on the political spectrum. There is fairly devastating stuff happening all over the globe on these risks. I mean, I suspect we all saw the absolutely horrific Texas floods. There are wildfires. I'm from BC in Canada. Every year I watch the wildfires spread across the province. It doesn't matter where we sit, those are factually happening to us. And there is galvanizing sort of effort and an international community around how do we actually deal with that, because so many of us are in the same boat of different countries having to actually manage that risk on our populations, obviously the big one in the UK being floods. From maybe just back to the exam question that you posed us, what do we do as change agents? I think self-reflection is quite good on that. So I live in London. That is my 12th city and my 6th country. I am comfortable with change. I know that about myself. I am probably not the best barometer for where most people are with change. And I think one of the aspects of self-reflection in this period of polarization is, to one of the points that was made, listening. Because again, that kernel of truth, why some people are nervous about some of the work happening within this space, there might be some very legitimate trade-offs that they are worried about from their perspective that I think it is very important to reflect and think about. And doing that listening, I think, will lead, and making sure whatever counterparts, wherever you are, whatever your role in this is, are feeling heard, at least on the stuff that is legitimately there. It is important in being able to take the work forward and continue with some momentum in this space. I do think another one is going back into that mandate point. I have a legal mandate in my day job. many of you will have, if you're in a listed company, you will have the public markets, your shareholders, whatever that is, whatever those stakeholders are, you do have to think about what are you actually doing, and you can bring a strong sustainability lens and a strong focus to this work, but you do also have to think about what is the core of that mandate wherever you are in the sort of broader scheme of things. And I think one last one, and this is probably sort of a thread throughout some of what I've heard, but definitely I see within our space, is that commercial component. So many times I have been in excellent discussions surrounded by so many people with great ideas, and not a single person within that room owns a P&L, makes a commercial decision in their day job, and we have the space to be much more idealistic about it. And then you get in the bankers, the insurers, the people who are actually there to make a commercial decision. They said, that's not going to work. Why were they not engaged? Why was that not being co-designed, co-developed from the beginning? I think that's going to be really fundamentally important in taking this forward, because it's not just something where we have that space. Because, I mean, we do have to hit the ground running now on so much of it. We need it to work in practice, and that means bringing all of the voices together and making sure that it works in practice. And that means working across many, many different parts of the industries we operate in. So hopefully that brings us to a close on the presentation part of the panel.
Thank you, Alicia and Andre, for the financial sector. Okay, let's throw this open to the room. There's a mic somewhere, or just shout out really loud so everyone can hear, please. We got a mic, but if the mic takes too long, let's just shout out, because life's too short. We need the mic. Okay. All right. We're waiting for the mic. Brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Hi. Ooh. Good morning. Robert Hume from West Yorkshire Pension Fund. We're a local government pension scheme. We are an asset owner. One of the problems we're seeing in terms of polarisation, yes, there's passionate believers and there's naysayers, but we also see a massive problem is disinformation, misinformation, greenwashing. Mm-hmm. And at this point, I kind of get like the investigator in an inspector calls, who is guilty? And I would say you're all guilty. So if you look at Andre, fine words, JP Morgan, Chase Center for Carbon Transition, sounds lovely, but JP Morgan lends £50 billion a year to fossil fuels. Holly, Equinor, the renewable stuff is great, but the LNG business is highly questionable and will break your 2050 carbon provinces. So the resolution that we co-signed last year was explain that plan in the context of the 2050 commitment. Joanna, IKEA does make a lot of crap that is not readily renewable. Alicia, we are currently applying for our FC license, so I would like to say you do some darn good work.
Can I ask you also say something rude about me?
I love your shirt.
And also, can you ask a question also at the end?
Discuss.
Brilliant. And that is truth-telling, and in the spirit of proper debate that's not just black and white, please, let's have some, fairly brief thoughts, reflections from anyone who wants to go.
Can I talk about trust? Because I think that's one of the key things that's probably at the heart of your question. And I think that the other side of the coin to disinformation is trust and lack of it. And whether it's the Edelman Trust Barometer or any other of the learned looks into this, we know that trust in institutions is declining. And we know that we're becoming more polarised and fragmented, and I think that's part of it. And so I think that in terms of kind of creating this shared literacy, which I think is what we need, when we think about how we understand the problems and how we think about the solutions, we also need some shared trust. So at IKEA, maker of some crap as well as some good stuff, the idea that a big Swedish brand was going to start telling people how to live, you know, even the people in IKEA realised that probably wasn't a good idea. And so when I suggested that we do this sort of social experiments around how people live and start talking about sustainability, it went down like a lead balloon. And one of the reasons was because the folk in business leadership and marketing said, what if people don't believe us? What if they're going to say bad stuff about us? What if they think our products are crap? What if they think we don't have any mandate to talk about sustainability? And I said, well, then they think that. And they're already thinking that. And that conversation's already happening. And unless we join in that conversation and understand why, and understand what it means for them, and then understand what we can do differently, then we're not going to move the dial. So the idea of leaning into conversations with people who we don't necessarily rub shoulders with every day, and listening to each other and understanding what our needs are actually, and therefore what better might look like and what the outcome is really important. And then the other part of that, I think, is who we trust and who we listen to. And we tend to listen to our peers and people like us rather than politicians, rather than business leaders, and rather than brands. So I think it's also creating context where we can open up the conversation so we all have that shared literacy and opportunity to talk to each other, so that it's not it's other people telling us how to live is important. I hope that helps.
Very quick comments, very quick, because we've only got like a few minutes left.
Yeah, just to build on what Joanna was saying in terms of trust, I think one essential element of that is transparency as a currency for trust. And the more data that companies publish and make available to researchers, the better we can build the trust and actually start to achieve change. Although the more data you publish, the more you hold yourself open to potential scrutiny as well. So it's the right thing to do, even if it's risky as well.
And in my experience, they're going to find the bad stuff anyway. So unless you talk about the whole picture, all you get known for is bad stuff.
Andre, Alicia.
Look, I think, there's a few things to say. I mean, first of all, you can throw numbers at me. We're also the world's largest green bank. And ultimately, any financial institution reflects the real economy. So that's the reflection you need to look at, is whatever a bank's portfolio looks like is the reality of what the real economy looks like. Yes, those numbers may be big in certain sectors. They're big in every sector that we're in. That's just the reality, given the function of our size as an institution. But you've actually got to look at the fact that some of those numbers are clients that are actually transitioning. And that's the key part of this discussion, is you're not going to, the energy transition is just that, it's a transition. It's moving from one state to another. And it is going to take a lot of capital for that to change. It's not going to happen overnight. And it is those companies, a lot of the energy companies are the ones that are going to be the vehicles that actually deliver the transition. So I think, you can throw numbers and highlights at people. You've got to actually look at the reality of the broader picture and the role that, again, financial institutions play within that ecosystem.
Alicia.
Thank you. I'm normally attacked on every panel I sit on, so thank you. Actually, the transition point was the one I was going to make as well, which is there is a push now in the transition and in adaptation that we aren't just stepping away from these hard-to-abate sectors. So we have spent a certain amount of time telling the banks that actually, and financial institutions and businesses more generally, that how much you have on your balance sheet, those emissions matter. Now we're saying, actually, could you still finance them, but move them over and support them and going towards the transition? And I think there does need to be probably a fair amount of education in the broader economy on what that is going to mean, because it is something that is actually part of a national as well as an international policy to move and to support that transition. So it is going to put a lot of firms in a tough place. I will just quickly say we do have the anti-greenwashing rule along with the CMA and the ASA, and we do think about all of that within this context as well.
And I have a question for you, which is, what do your pensioners want you to invest in? Mm-hmm. And how are you finding that? And also, if they do want to invest in green, could they invest in Joanna's outfit?
Thank you.
There is a great deal of interest from our members into many of the themes being touched on today. So transition, certainly, we get a lot of pressure in terms of divestment, which we're not especially keen on. We're certainly going down the engagement route. So, I think the first slide covered it all. Most people are very interested and very engaged in terms of climate change.
Brilliant, brilliant. I think we've got time for a couple more questions, and please keep them, don't hold back. Please. We've got 1, 2, 3, and then I think we're cooked.
To your right. Oh.
Hi, Mona from Net Zero Investor. Oh, I could hear myself very loudly there suddenly. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Holly Pattenden made on the resolutions filed at the AGM. I think Robert spoke about that briefly as well. There were obviously quite a lot of resolutions filed, but I think, and there was something on banning offshore wind, right? But the point on getting out of fossil fuels altogether, I didn't quite get, because the ACCR resolution was actually probably more on, backed by Sam Pension and Folksam, and I think maybe also West Yorkshire, was actually more on Paris alignment. So kind of realizing that we're coming towards the end of the discussion, I think my question is more around red lines. Equinor obviously expands at the moment fossil fuel production. I think that's something we should perhaps be talking about. And where are your red lines at the moment? Because Paris seems to be pretty much dead in the water. So you can engage with both sides, but if you don't have any red lines, doesn't it become a bit meaningless?
Holly.
Yes, of course, countries comply with the Paris Agreement rather than companies, but we've been very keen to demonstrate that we've set a net zero 2050 target and targets and shorter term targets to massively reduce the carbon intensity of our products. It's a real challenge because, in general, oil and gas gets a 15 to 25% return. Very high risk, high return business. When we produce renewables, it's very difficult to get into double-digit returns. So there is pressure from the shareholders, the Norwegian government being the biggest, but with the other institutional shareholders as well, to say, why would you invest our capital? Why would you shift it from a high return area into a low return area? So that's one of the challenges that we face when dealing with stakeholders. But of course, we have to do it because otherwise the company will not be sustainable in the future. In terms of red lines, there are certain areas of natural resources that we wouldn't get into. So one of the things that we did shortly after I joined the company was to sell out of Canadian oil sands because the emissions intensity of those was very high. And we've set quite strong targets in terms of levels of emissions intensity that we wouldn't go above when it comes to business development and buying fields. I think the challenge is, when it comes to both the companies and countries, the easiest way to decarbonise is to sell your assets. The easiest way for the UK to decarbonise would be to shut down all industry. And in an oil and gas company, it would be to sell all of your oil and gas assets. The challenge with doing that is that the people to whom you sell them, are they going to manage them in a more responsible way? Are they going to manage them in a more transparent way and publish the data around them? There are questions around that. And in terms of the global impact of that kind of approach, it isn't necessarily the optimal one for tackling global climate change. So we've got to try and solve the problems within, but also with an eye to what the global effect is.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question, which was, please.
Great panel, really enjoyed it. My name is Matt Scott. I work here for the Sustainable Finance Group. Also work with Mark Carney at the Bank of England. So I've been thinking about this whole area of climate risk for quite some time. And I think we are at a sort of interesting junction when we're realizing, as we think about climate risk, there's actually a distinction between finance and business as a risk taker, and actually trying to be resilient to the risks of today. And then also the private sector as a risk shaper. Right, so the role that the finance sector can play in helping to support the transition. And it's interesting that as we look about emissions, really emissions aren't really a great measure either for a risk-taking perspective or either a sort of risk-shaping perspective. So I guess my question would be, it feels like we're at a slightly paradigm shifting point as we're trying to deal not only with the risks of today, but also with the systemic issue. And then who oversees the systemic risk and where do responsibilities sit?
All right, and can we appoint Alicia to answer that?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi,
Nice to see you.
I thought you'd appreciate that.
Within the UK, I am also ex-Bank of England. Within the UK, that sits with the Bank of England in terms from a national level in terms of the systemic risks. And I think within the global economy, that is one that international sort of work will be really important in, because these are not risks that are going to stop at our borders and then not spill over or spill over from other jurisdictions into ours. So from a sort of systemic risk perspective, I do think that there will be a role for government, the regulators, and for international cooperation. I do think, though, that then feeds down into the companies that are regulated. And I obviously can't speak for the bank, but the whole reason we have capital requirements are to try to manage some of these financial stability risks and these systemic risks that are coming out of this. I do think it will be a field, and I would say that across the board for a lot of this work. This is a field that is going to continue to evolve and will continue at pace. And I actually often say when I speak publicly that very rarely in a regulated space are you told, there is a rule and you have to follow that rule in 99% of cases. But actually in sustainable finance and the complexity of what we operate in here, there are times where we say, actually, this has to improve and iterate over the next few years, because we realize the science is still changing, the science is evolving. That's true for things like transition plans. And we do have to show a certain level of flexibility, because whatever we develop now might not be relevant in 5 to 10 years' time. And I assure you guys that is difficult when you are a policymaker, because you are trying to predict this future that you can't possibly know exactly how that's going to look. So it is one where we will be evolving, and I think we will need to engage very actively.
Thank you. Before we close, can I just ask all four of you, less than 10 words, for the change agents in the room, what's the one thing you really think will be helpful in this incredibly complicated, challenging, polarized, conflicted mess that we're in? What's the one tool in the arsenal that you really think is important?
I think open debate and treating others with courtesy and good humor in that debate.
Bravo, bravo.
I think shared literacy, achieved through active listening, radical collaboration, and radical transparency that goes with that.
But you've also said something about better, like your vision. I loved your positivity.
Yes, I think that, yes, okay. Thank you reminding me that. In order to create a vision of a better future, a better way of life, that's the brief. Everything else we do is just tools and steps to achieve that brief.
The work is harder, but that makes it matter more. So keep your resilience up.
Andre?
I think it's just about being clear-eyed and really focusing on the right issues, because the outcomes are ones we're all striving for. I don't think there's disagreement on the outcomes. It's just a matter of really understanding what is holding us back, and let's focus on how we get over those obstacles.
Folks, we're out of time. Will you join me in thanking this panel?
So don't go anywhere. We have the next plenary session coming up right now.